So, welcome to lesson 2, technically your first video lesson. Why did the alliance break down in 1945? 3 conferences. This is topic 4. Who was more to blame for the Cold War? So we begin. The first thing you need to understand before we get anywhere into this topic is the fact that from the 2 perspectives, that of the West, including USA and Great Britain, and that of the Soviet Union, there are massive pre-war ideological differences, and these 2 countries were not friends in any way. Let's look at it from the Soviet perspective. Why would an alliance, say, not for Adolf Hitler and the Nazis invading Russia in 1941, been almost an impossible conception? The first thing is that the Western powers, after the First World War, USA and Great Britain in particular, intervened in the Russian Civil War in order to stop communism from spreading. When the communists won this, their successive leaders were deeply distrustful from their experiences fighting with the Red Army against the Whites, supported by the United States and Great Britain. During the Russian Civil War, which lasted until about 1922-1923, Stalin believed that when he comes to power, now Stalin replaces Lenin and is probably firmly in charge of the Soviet Union, though the actual date is up for dispute from 1928 forward, that the United States and Britain were happy to see the resurgence of Germany. Russia's primary concern was that Germany, a country that had invaded them for all intents and purposes, and had been their mortal enemy up until the point when they forced them to sign a horrifically punitive peace treaty in 1918 during the First World War, a country that had really destroyed large parts, 1/3 approximately of Russia, be completely punished. And they were nervous about a resurgent Germany under Adolf Hitler. Of course, they were made even more nervous by the fact that in books like Mein Kampf, Hitler talked about destroying the Bolshevik Soviet menace, etc., etc., etc. So Stalin, distrustful of that, actually is more akin to aligning himself with Germany than he is with the Allies. In 1939, he signs what's known as the Nazi-Soviet Pact. That pact is a defensive alliance against ostensibly France, Great Britain, and the United States, but it assures, at least at that particular moment, that Hitler and Stalin will not be at war with each other. Now, the fact that Hitler does invade and breaks this pact draws Stalin into an alliance, sort of unwillingly, with the West. Now, that alliance is even, I suppose, more peculiar when you consider the Western perspective. The USA and Britain are suspicious of the Soviet Union. Number one, they fear communism. The ideology itself would undermine the capitalists, but more particularly, that the communists had an ambition to set up communist states all over Europe. There was an organization called Comintern that actually had that distinct purpose. Comintern was in every major city in Europe, was supported by the Soviet Union. And in some cases, like a brief German revolution in 1919, Comintern is actually in direct communication with Lenin in Moscow, trying to sow rebellion in Germany and turn that into a communist country. So the threat for them is very real, and this is something that they're fearful. Not to mention the fact that senior communists, not to mention the aforementioned Trotsky, had talked openly for years about a worldwide communist revolution and sort of the increasing potential for conflict between communism and capitalism in the near future. And of course, all of these people are looking at the actual writings of Marx and Engels, who said that the worldwide communist revolution, the workers will rise up and overthrow their capitalist overlords, and it's only a matter of time, sort of fueled their thinking, but it also fueled their rhetoric. And their rhetoric was very concerning to any Western leader of a capitalist country trying to ensure stability in their particular region. And, you've got to consider during the 1930s, France is practically a communist country. I mean, they have a socialist government that is very, very left-leaning, not quite communist, but there's certainly the fear is there in Britain. There's a pretty healthy communist movement amongst the working class. And in the United States, less so, but nevertheless, the fear is very great. Now, when they get into this alliance to defeat Germany, the USSR goes from being really the great enemy, the great red menace, if you will, to being their friend. And such is common with propaganda, that you sort of suit it to the needs of the time. And this is not different of the situation in World War II. Of course, the USSR was painted as their friend for the common goal of defeating Nazism. And of course, the horrors of the war in the East, particularly the treatment of Russian civilians, not the least of which the Jews and the Holocaust, are portrayed correctly in Western media as, horrors subjected upon the Russian people, and as such, you need to be sympathetic to the plight of the Russians, and we need to work with our Russian allies. So there are, as a result of this extensive cooperation during the war, the U.S. and Britain primarily supplied the USSR with raw material by sea through the Northern Corridor, an extremely treacherous route which involves sailing up north around Norway, Sweden, Finland, into Russia through the Arctic Sea. And the dangers faced by the sailors on that route is not to be underestimated. The USA will also extend the Lend-Lease Agreement, which is a financial bonus to countries fighting Nazi Germany. And they'll give this to the USSR. And of course, the USSR had been completely cut off from the economy of the United States and the West, for that matter, up until this point. So this is a massive step forward in terms of agreement. Now, the disagreements, on the other hand, don't necessarily go away, although you can say that conditions improved. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin will meet for the first time in 1943 in Tehran, and they'll agree on a date for the invasion of Western Europe, which will become D-Day. But of course, throughout this period, military officials work together and cooperate very often. Most famously, some of the codes from the Bletchley Park code breakers were given to the Russians so that they were able to defeat the Germans at the Battle of Kursk, for instance. All that said, though, beneath the surface there were tensions. Stalin was obsessively secret. He wouldn't share his battle plans with the Western Allies, though they would him. Churchill would not share his knowledge of the Enigma codes with Stalin. So even though the British were giving the Russians secret information, they weren't telling them how they got it, and the fact that they had this code-breaking school at Bletchley Park. And of course, these things sort of sowed the seeds of distrust. British and American pilots who flew in supplies to the USSR complained that the Soviets didn't trust them. Oftentimes they were allowed off the planes, or in some cases out of the airfields. Sailors experienced a very similar thing. After braving the treacherous northern Arctic waters, they arrive in Russian ports like Archangel and aren't allowed to leave their ships. Political suspicion grew on all fronts, even though these countries are ostensibly collaborating to defeat Germany. So by 1943, it's pretty obvious to everyone that Germany is going to lose this war, and the tide has turned. So what really comes into the forefront is the fact that the Allies are going to want different things. The cooperation is great, 41 to 43, but when the end is in sight, the sort of alliance between the victorious powers begins to dissolve in a good way. The US, UK, and USSR, they had been united in a shotgun marriage of convenience against Hitler, but they were different politically, economically, socially, and each wanted to arrange the world in an order that would benefit itself. Now, the British wanted to maintain their empire, retain their close imperial economic system where, you know, in the absence of free trade, all of the British dominions would have access to British goods, but they wouldn't be able necessarily to buy American goods without high tariffs. And this really boosted the British economy. And the British government was really concerned about maintaining their empire after the war. The United States, on the other hand, wanted to reshape the world into a Western sphere of influence dominated by the United States and get rid of the British system of free trade, and rather of closed trade, and bring in a system of free markets where the U.S. would have be able to flex their industrial muscle and sort of sell goods cheaply on the open market, undercutting the British, and, well, I suppose to the extent the USSR and other countries. But the Russians also want their own sphere of influence. They want to dominate Eastern Europe and keep Germany militarily weak and advance Marxism, socialist interests worldwide. So not necessarily, perhaps, as vocal as Trotsky about starting worldwide revolution, but to encourage the growth of as many communist states as it possibly could in a post-war world. So we get the situation where the big three leaders meet for the first time in Tehran. Of course, you have Stalin, Franklin Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. This is a picture of them at the Tehran conference. There are several pictures of them together. At the end of the war in the Potsdam conference, it'll be interesting to note that two of the three men in this picture will not be there. Hint, hint, it's not Stalin. Now, what happens at the first conference? And relations here are pretty amicable, actually. Roosevelt is pretty keen to improve relations between the Allies and agrees to hold the meeting nearer to the Soviet Union, and therefore is held in Iran, in the capital of Tehran. This meeting is mostly summed up as a success for Stalin. Basically, the Allies give in. Roosevelt starts to become unwell. He had polio, but his health begins to very much decline, and Churchill tends to side with Stalin. Roosevelt tends to side with Stalin over Churchill. Churchill had a bunch of different aims. Of course, his underlying aim is to preserve the British Empire, so he's looking at things that will set the post-war world up as most advantageously for Britain. And he sees that probably the best idea is to invade Germany through the Balkans, Croatia, and Bosnia today, rather than France. And he basically, his idea was to prevent the USSR from getting all of Eastern Europe. The British have interests in Greece, and the Dardanelles Strait, where the former Turkey is, and of course, the Suez Canal, and any sort of Russian incursion into the lower eastern Mediterranean would be a threat to Great Britain. So he's sort of aiming at a southern invasion of Germany, and Roosevelt rejects the idea and sides with Stalin that the invasion must come in France. They made through agreements, and of course Churchill sort of acquiesces. He's not massively in a power position here, of course, because the United States is so heavily supporting the British war effort that Churchill must continue to follow the line that Roosevelt sets down. So the US and the UK and the USA would open up a second front. They do this by invading France in May of 1944, of course, due to weather that's pushed back largely into June 1944, of course, D-Day being June 6, 1944. The USSR, on the other hand, would wage war in Japan when Germany was defeated to support the Americans who were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific. They agreed that a new League of Nations style assembly would be held, this time called the United Nations, and it would be set up after the war. They would all be equal participants. And they also agreed that some of eastern Poland, parts that had used to be part of the old Russian Empire, would be given to the USSR. Between the conferences, though, the rivalry begins to intensify. The USSR and the Allies are becoming massively suspicious. The Americans and the British, more particularly, are suspicious of what the Russians are going to do. The Russians are taking massive amounts of territory back from the Germans in 1944 and 1945. And the real worry amongst the Allies is they're not going to leave. And as we know from the post-war world, their worry is actually pretty well founded. So their distrust of Uncle Joe, as what it was called, Uncle Joe Stalin, that is, as he was called in the American press, begins to grow greatly between the war. Now, a couple things. Stalin, on the other hand, isn't necessarily thrilled himself. He's annoyed that the UK and the USSR are delaying D-Day. They left the invasion quite long, ostensibly to build up their resources, but he thought that they did this so that the Germans would destroy the USSR, even though I suppose the Russians were clearly winning the Eastern Front at that particular time. Churchill, very much a capitalist and ideologically opposed to Bolshevik communist revolution, is convinced that the Soviet troops would stay in Eastern Europe. Poland is the major concern. Britain went to war in 1939 to defend Poland, if you recall, and Churchill is suspicious that the Soviets will end up staying in Poland, and basically says that Soviets want Poland. And Churchill's saying, probably within reason, that we went to war and we're in this war to defend the country of Poland. I'm not about to let it become dominated by yet another a dictator-like individual, Joseph Stalin. And for the Russians, of course, their actions in the Warsaw Uprising, not helping the Polish resistance, who were destroyed by Germany, really left Poland defenseless, and this seems to confirm Churchill's suspicions of the Soviet Union. Now, just a quick recap. In 1944, the Polish resistance, which had fought against Nazi Germany, rises up in Warsaw, the capital, to try and overthrow the German government there. The German Gauleiter in charge of Poland, his name is Hans Frank, orders the German army to go in. Now, the Russians are in a position here where they could help the Polish resistance. In fact, they're very close to Warsaw at the particular time. The timing of the resistance was to coincide with the Russian invasion of Warsaw to reclaim it from the Nazis. The Russians actually stood back, and they let the Germans destroy the cream of the Polish resistance. And as such, essentially, what would be comprised of a Polish army after the war. After the war, Poland's left with nothing. The resistance, or what that there was, the army, the military-minded people were all killed by the Nazis in the Polish resistance. And the retribution of the Nazis is horrendous in the situation of the Polish resistance. And this basically leaves Poland defenseless. So, from an outside observer's viewpoint, the Americans, and more particularly Churchill and the British, concluded that the Russians were doing this on purpose. They wanted a Poland that was completely defenseless to a Russian takeover there later on. So that brings us to the situation where the war is almost over. It's early 1945, February to be specific. And the Allies are now looking at what's going to come afterwards. The war is basically won. It's going to take a lot of fighting and a horrendous amount of human life, but nevertheless, it's convinced the Germans are going to lose. The Allies are closing in on Berlin from both sides, and the leaders decide that they're going to meet in Yalta to decide what to do with Germany and Europe once the war was over. I suppose they're still somewhat fearful of Hitler. The German army wasn't entirely destroyed. So they sort of agree on most things because the job isn't finished yet. This is really the last meeting. Well, this is the last meeting of the big three leaders. Unfortunately, between the Yalta Conference and the Potsdam Conference, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, sitting there with a blanket around him, will die. He's quite ill at this particular moment. And Churchill, on the other hand, will lose the next election, as I'll yield to. So, just to run through briefly, even though, their distrust is setting in and the alliance is breaking down, Yalta yields some pretty important agreements as seen here. Just in brief, Germany is going to be divided into 4 zones, occupied and administered by one of the Allies, the 4th zone being administered by the French, who are a newly liberated power at this time, but not a member of the big three. Berlin itself would be divided into 4 zones, administered by of course, the French, the British, the Americans, and the Russians. The USSR would join the war against Japan, as they had alluded to doing in the previous conference. So when Germany was defeated, prominent Nazis would be hunted down and put on trial in an international court, which becomes the Nuremberg trials. Liberated countries would hold free elections, which would become a point of contention. And then they would all join the UN. Eastern Europe, of course, would be a Soviet sphere of influence. Now, the degree to which control would be sort of exerted over that was yet decided by Stalin. But there are some key disagreements. Number one, the Soviet Union wants Germany to pay a ton of money in reparation, very similar to the sort of punitive settlement that was imposed on Germany after the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles, but only probably a lot more. Poland, Stalin wanted a Polish-German border to be further west. He wanted a larger and friendly Polish government. Western leaders feared his intentions here. They actually thought he meant a Soviet-controlled government when he said friendly, but it was still a little bit unclear. They disagreed on what Poland would look like. They do persuade Stalin at this time to allow free elections in Poland, but as we'll see, Stalin isn't necessarily a man of his word in that respect. So between Yalta and Potsdam, there are a few more changes. The first one, of course, being that Soviet troops have liberated almost all of the countries in Eastern Europe, and they don't remove their military presence. The war ends in Europe in May 1945, and Potsdam is in July 1945. The Americans and the British and the Canadians and the Australians and whoever else was there begin to send their troops home. The Soviets don't. They keep their troops in heavy numbers, almost like an occupying force. In fact, as an occupying force in Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Stalin begins also to set up communist governments up in these countries, more particularly in Poland. He ignores the wishes of the Poles to allow and the agreements made to allow free elections. He insists that this was a defensive measure to prevent against future German attack, but in all of the seriousness, the German army is completely crushed. There's barely a government there. The country is in complete ruins. The Red Army also expands. In fact, Stalin starts to recruit more soldiers when the war ends, and he refuses to demilitarize like the Americans, that were destroying their tanks and planes or decommissioning some or sending their soldiers home. Stalin actually increases the size of his military presence in Europe, and he expands his armed forces. And of course, the big ones are the fact that President Roosevelt dies, and he's replaced with Harry Truman. Harry Truman is his vice president, and Harry Truman is very different to Roosevelt. He distrusts Stalin. He's not willing to work with him. He's a hardliner. And he believes that Stalin is intended to take over all of Europe, and he's determined, unlike Roosevelt, to compromise. He's determined to stand up to Stalin and not compromise, and this sort of really deepens and darkens relations between the powers. Not to mention the fact that on the 16th of July 1945, the Americans successfully tested an atomic bomb. At the start of the Potsdam Conference, Truman informed Stalin that he had done so, and Stalin's furious. He can't believe that the Americans had not consulted him. Now, it's very interesting to note, in fact, that Stalin totally knew the Americans were developing an atomic bomb. He knew they tested it. He knew within minutes that they had successfully tested it in the deserts of New Mexico, because, of course, his operatives in the KGB told him about the bomb. He pretended he didn't know in order to sort of stoke the fire between him and his new opponent, to give him a bargaining chip to perhaps yield more from the Allies at the Potsdam Conference. And one of the more interesting aspects is Churchill, at the Potsdam Conference, loses an election halfway through. He actually has to leave the Potsdam Conference, and he's defeated by a man named Clement Attlee leading the Labour Party. And Attlee actually comes to the Potsdam Conference in the middle of it and takes over from Churchill as the new Prime Minister of Great Britain. So there's a complete temperature shift. Two rookies, in fact, dealing with a seasoned old pro in Joseph Stalin. In a lot of ways, the Potsdam Conference is hindered by that, but at the same time, the nature of this conference changes. This is a real, in many ways, a breakdown of relations. So what are the big things at Potsdam? There are some agreements. Of course, they agreed to demilitarize Germany, reestablish democracy in Germany, free elections and free press. Of course, this will only be in the Allied zones. They'll divide Germany into 4 sectors as previously agreed. The Nazis will be banned. Leading Nazis put on trial at Nuremberg. Germany is to pay some reparations to Allies, mostly in equipment and material. Most of this, of course, will go to the Soviet Union in compensation because, of course, the Soviet Union suffered most during the war. All countries will participate fully in the UN, and Poland's frontier is actually going to be moved a little bit further westwards towards the River Oder and Ness on the German western border. So what compromised the German state of East Prussia, a state that had been in existence for hundreds of years, really since the time of Frederick the Great, was effectively hacked off and given to Poland. Now, the Potsdam disagreements are many and varied. It's really the last thing I want to do. They really disagree with what they're going to do with Germany. The USSR wants a huge compensation to cripple Germany. Truman refuses as he doesn't want a repeat of the Versailles Treaty, but Stalin wants to protect the USSR from future threats and disable Germany. So that's a big bone of contention. And the other one is free election. Stalin outright refuses and goes back on his agreements made at Yalta and alluded to, at least initially speaking in Tehran, to allow the Eastern Europeans to select the form of government they want through free elections. He basically thought that, the U.S. have done nothing to capture these are mine. U.S. interference is unhelpful and unwelcome. And he will not allow free elections, and he will impose communist-style governments and/or basically through a series of dirty tricks, as we'll learn later, impose Soviet dominance on Eastern Europe. Truman, completely disgusted with this, begins a get tough policy with the USSR, and really at this particular moment the Cold War is born. So just a quick look as we end our lesson on what the world will look like. Of course, we have here in the darker green, the British, French, and US occupied zones, the yellow, the Soviet occupied zones of Germany. You have areas in the gray are states liberated by the Soviet army. In the sort of, I don't know what that is, light yellow, greenish tint, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, part of Belarusia, Ukraine, and Bulgaria. You get the areas of former German and Czechoslovak territory that were just annexed or taken by the Soviet Union in 1945 and incorporated into the larger Soviet Union as a whole. Those states would lose their independence entirely at this particular time. And then the rest of it, of course, is territory annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 and 1940 and reincorporated in 1945. So this is what the world looks like, and this is where the Cold War starts. And when we talk about things like the Iron Curtain, you need to think about it as where that red line is. Really the dividing line between the West and the American sphere of influence and the East, the Soviet sphere of influence.